start my introduction. It's a great pleasure to welcome Redford, who is well known to most of you in this room, as I can tell from the faces. He's a graduate of this department, a friend and colleague, so I'm very pleased he's here with us the whole academic year with an Aga Khan fellowship that and we all look to interact with him. So Scott Redford is a professor in Koç University in the Department of Archaeology and History of Art. He's also the director of what is known as RCAC for sort of insiders, which means Research Center for Anatolian Civilizations in Istanbul, to which many of our students as well as colleagues go productively. His area of expertise is Anatolia and the Eastern Mediterranean between the 12th and 14th centuries. And in the last 10 years, he has worked especially on inscriptions of monuments, particularly the Seljuk dynasty, many of the city walls and so on, which culminated, you can, thank you, Tom, which culminated in his latest book, which is due next month, on the inscriptions of the Sinop castle in the Black Sea area. It is called Legends of Authority, the 1215 Seljuk inscriptions of Sinop Citadel, and it will come out from Koç University Press. So while he's here this year, he will be free from administrative and teaching duties and focus on the publication of the Crusader, Armenian and Mamluk levels of the site of Kinet, Höyük, where he was director of medieval operations for Bilkent University, and that's the subject of his lecture today. And he's particularly using the data from those excavations to examine the relations between the Frankish states and the Eastern Mediterranean sort of Islamic and Christian communities between the 12th and 14th centuries. I can't wait to listen, but I would like to, in the meantime, just give some highlights from his many publications. Also, in terms of when he received his degree here, if you want to calculate, his PhD was in 1989 here, and before that he studied Near Eastern Studies in Princeton University with an BA from Princeton in '78, and from Columbia University in 1980 he received Middle East languages and civilizations. Now there are actually many works in forthcoming, which is very exciting. The books that he published in 2008 with Yari Leiser. It's called Victory Inscribed, the Seljuk Fetihname on the citadel walls of Antalya. And in 2000, Landscape and the State in Medieval Anatolia, Seljuk Gardens and Pavilions of Alanya. So he has focused a lot on the garden pavilions and also discovered or interpreted as a group pavilions not only in Alanya but around Konya and the like. So forthcoming a submitted article is Paper, Stone, Scissors, İsmet Dünya with Din Alauddin Keykubat and the Writing of Seljuk History. coming out in an edited book called The Seljuks of Anatolia, Court and Society in the Medieval Middle East, from Ivy Torres. The editors are Peacock, Andrew Peacock, and Sarah Nur Yıldız. Now, this is a new sort of group of emerging sort of star scholars in Seljuk studies who have really made the field, put it on the map, so to speak, and they all get along, which is wonderful. So
I don't include myself, I'm not emerging at all.
No, I mean, not the scholars emerging, the field emerging. Thanks to you as a group, the field from its obscurity coming out and becoming also tied not just to Crusader Frankish connections, but also to Mongol connections, Byzantine, yeah. Byzantine is obvious, so I didn't count it at all. Yes. Impress is a book, I'm sorry, an article, City Building in Seljuk Room, in a book called The Seljuks, Politics, Society and Culture, coming out in Edinburgh University Press. And another one is Trade and Economy in Antioch and Cilicia in the 12th and 13th centuries, coming out from Dumbarton Oaks. So you can see how sort of widely branching out these studies are. And also in 2008, Ibn Battuta visits southern Anatolia. Again, another collection. And he also has worked and curated exhibitions. One of them, the recent one in 2011, was Digging Antioch, photographs from the 1932-37 Princeton Louvre excavations. Without reading his whole CV, I invite him.
Thank you very much.
It's a great pleasure to be here, and I hope you're not going to fall asleep when the lights go off because it's a little warm in here. Thank you in advance for your tolerance of a lot of archaeological material. I'd like to figure these things out first. Yes. I'd like to say that, of course, Kinet is a multi-period site, and we are lucky here in Boston to have the director of the Kinet excavations, Professor Gates, giving a talk on the Bronze Age in January of next year. So if people are interested in the earlier periods, especially the Bronze Age, here is the information about her presentation. Here she is. And this slide tells you a lot about the relationship between the two of us. I'd like to start my presentation with a series of frames, or spaces, if you will. More and more in my work, I find myself making connections with cultures and traditions other than the ones I'm studying, whether contemporaneous with the topic of my study or not. And while I am not a geographical determinist, there are overlaps between issues that those studying the Eastern Mediterranean and Southwest Asia in the Bronze and Iron Ages, for instance, share with those who are studying the archaeology of medieval Eastern Mediterranean, the era that I just call, by shorthand, the Crusader era. This evening, after outlining some intellectual concerns of the time and how they were reflected in choices made on or in the ground, I'll turn to excavations at the site of Kinet. After narrating the medieval occupation there, I'll conclude my talk by addressing problems of interpreting medieval Kinet, Crusader archaeology, and historical archaeology in general. I've got to get this right. Okay. In the 1930s, there was a series of choices made that profoundly affected and still affect the study of the cultures of all of these eras, the second and first millennia BC and the second millennium AD. And unlikely pairing heads my bill this evening, Hetty Goldman, excavator of Tarsus, and Leonard Woolley, for our purposes here, excavator at Almina and Tel Achana. In the 1920s and 1930s, both were searching for connections between the Aegean, the Minoans and Mycenaeans, the Levant, and through the Levant, the early civilizations of Mesopotamia, what Goldman once called, and I quote, the fecund breezes which blow out of the east, unquote, affecting the Aegean Bronze Age, the Greeks, and by extension, the origins of Western civilization. And I don't know which way the breezes are blowing. You'll have to look at the clouds, but here's the general picture. Both archaeologists came to the northeastern corner of the Mediterranean at the same time, looking for those east-west breezes. Hetty Goldman chose the mound of Gözlükule at Tarsus in the Cilician plain, a port, but near the gates, there are lots of gates in this presentation, that connected that region to central Anatolia. Woolley came to the region around Antioch, where the Orontes River swerved west, cutting through the coastal mountains and debouching in the Mediterranean. Antioch is surrounded by the Amuk Plain, bristling with ancient settlement mounds. Antioch, according to medieval geographers, was only 2 days on horseback from Aleppo, itself only 2 days' ride from the Mediterranean, at the 2 days' ride from the Euphrates at its westernmost bend. So this is the fastest way to get from the Mediterranean to Mesopotamia, or the other way around. Beginning in 1932, Antioch was excavated by a team from Princeton with collaboration from the French Mandate authorities. Woolley came here looking for mounds, and I quote from one of his reports, with no Roman overburden, unquote, that would allow him to trace the relations, most specifically, between the Minoans and the Bronze Age Levant. Woolley was rewarded in his excavations at Tel Achana, which is otherwise known as Alalach here, Tel Achana, east of Antioch, excavations which, among many other things, rewarded him with a Bronze Age palace, with Minoan-like frescoes. I could only find an annulled copy of his famous book there on the internet. His findings have only been partially annulled by the present Koç University excavations at the same site, with Minoan-like frescoes, drawings of which you see there on the right. And you'll see them in the newly reinstalled Antakya Museum if you go there. But first, Woolley put in 2 seasons at the mouth of the Orontes, half buried in alluvium, at a site that's a small mound that was half buried in alluvium and half eaten away by a river that they don't call Asi for nothing. Asi means rebellious in Arabic and Turkish. Woolley abandoned work there summarily when no Bronze Age remains appeared. Instead of Roman overburden, Islamic and Crusader period levels topped the famous Iron Age levels there. During the second and final season, and that's really all you see when you go to the site now, during the second and final season, Woolley brought in Arthur Lane of the Victoria and Albert's ceramics department to work on the finds from the Islamic and Crusader levels. So when you go to Almina, really the only thing you see is the sheikh of the tomb of an anonymous Alevi sheikh, or relatively anonymous, somebody named Sheikh Yusuf. Hetty Goldman was granddaughter of the founder of Goldman Sachs, a Bryn Mawr graduate with a PhD in classical archaeology from Radcliffe, both institutions of higher learning restricted to women students. She started the Tarsus excavation as a fog museum project, but I haven't looked into the archives yet, with what was probably an entirely female team in the mid-1930s in provincial Turkey. Given the practical difficulties of life in provincial Turkey in the 1930s and her lack of experience there, this is her first excavation in Turkey, it is understandable why Goldman chose a mound that was and is literally next door to an American institution, the former St. Paul's College at Tarsus, which is now Tarsus American College. And I must say, since we have Boğaziçi University faculty, students, professors here, Boğaziçi University continues continues excavations here, partially with funding from one of the excavators of the 1930s first excavations. So here at Gözlü Kule was a rich mound with no Roman overburden, but again, like Elmina, with Islamic and medieval settlement atop earlier levels. Goldman kept within her women's space, these are all within in quotes, and missionary space by bringing in Florence Day, the daughter of missionaries who was at the American University in Beirut, to work on this later material. In the 1930s, most of the Middle East and the Eastern Mediterranean were under British and French occupation. Lack of time does not permit me to expostulate on the colonial archaeological space. For obvious reasons, I'd like to emphasize one parameter, the fascination of colonial authorities with the Crusader past, so with this map in their minds, while the actual map was this. With this map in their minds, fascination with the Crusader past that led to a survey of all of the Crusader monuments in Palestine and excavations at such Crusader sites as Atlit by C.N. Johns and others in the Colonial Department of Antiquities of Palestine, and French restorations at Crac des Chevaliers, which in Syria, of course, which in independence talks with the Syrians after World War II, as many of you know, French negotiators, an interesting negotiating strategy, French negotiators initially demanded that this castle be ceded in perpetuity to the French state as they're negotiating Syrian independence. Like classical archaeology, then Crusader archaeology was used to justify colonial rule. Even today, Arthur Lane is well known to those of us who study Islamic material culture. Florence Day, less so because she published so little. As concerns Tarsus, Day concentrated her energies on the Abbasid period finds, although she published a bit on the post-Abbasid as well. In fact, in a review she wrote in Ars Islamica of Lane's long article on Elmina, Day was the first to question Lane's naming of a new kind of medieval pottery from Elmina. Upstairs Tarsus and its relationship to Antakya and the, where is the, there's the Orontes right there. She was the first to question Lane's naming of a new kind of medieval pottery from Elmina, pointing out that it was found at Tarsus too, and elsewhere in the region. Still, the moniker stuck and sticks. It was given by Lane due to the fact that excavations uncovered evidence that this tricolored glazed earthenware had actually been produced at Elmina, or to use an English translation of its Crusader period name, Port Saint Symeon. You're going to hear a lot about Port Saint Symeon this evening. Port Saint Symeon ceramics have been found at medieval sites all around the Mediterranean basin, from the Crimea to Cairo and as far west as Genoa, and at inland sites in Syria, Palestine, and southeastern Turkey, but especially, as Florence Day pointed out, in Cilicia and the Amuk Plain and sites in between. As late as 1985, the noted Crusader scholar Dennis Pringle still called Port Saint Symeon ware, and I quote, Crusader ceramics par excellence, unquote, by virtue of Arthur Lane's identification of its production at the port of one Crusader state, that is the Franco-Norman Principality of Antioch, and what must have been its massive production and export in the 13th century, or else it wouldn't have been found all around the Black Sea and all around the Mediterranean and all around the Aegean. And yet the imagery found on Port Saint Symeon ceramics make them difficult to identify with many notions of Crusader rule in the East. Many Port Saint Symeon bowls bear non-figural imagery like knots, but those that do depict, in addition to birds, signs of the zodiac and representations of fantastic composite animals and young, beardless, male cupbearers dressed in robes and turbans, and sometimes both together. This is a bowl in the British Museum from the Almina excavations, paired with remnants of another bowl we found at Kinet. Here are the cupbearers, one of them found to the north of Kinet, one of them found at Almina itself, and two that were found actually in the Danish excavations in the 1930s in the central Syrian city of Hama. And by the way, with all of these names coming out, of course, it's a very difficult time to be talking about Syria. That's all I'll say right now. Okay. The Dumbarton Oaks Amphora, probably the most famous piece of Almina ware, and assigned now through chemical analysis of its fabric to production in the port of Almina itself, and a drawing of the figures all around it, showing you the fantastic beasts with a cupbearer on top of one of them. You can tell me what's happening in this scene. I certainly don't know. To be explicit, then, rare indeed are those Port Saint Symeon ceramics that bear imagery reflecting either a ruling Frankish knightly aristocracy or Christian symbols. And I show you two very rare examples here on the screen. Does not the material culture of a state reflect its norms? If not norms, then its ideals. What was going on in these northern Crusader states? Are we looking at examples of Oriental decadence, Franks going native? It's difficult to say. With archaeology regulated by the state, in any era it is impossible to enter into a power-free relationship. With a fast-growing population and many dams and other development projects, several of which you see on the screen, the southeastern Turkey dam building projects that started in the 1960s, a significant portion of archaeology since the 60s has served the state in the form of salvage archaeology in areas slated for flooding, construction, and or other forms of economic development. To open a parenthesis, a different but equally insidious linking of development and archaeology lies in tourism, but not in this region. In a Turkey striving for energy self-sufficiency, this region, the shores of the Gulf of Iskenderun, has turned into a focus for massive development, centering on pipelines and the petrochemical industry, with the odd steel mill thrown in for good measure. Professor Gates had worked on the Achana ceramics from Woolley's excavations there from her dissertation, and was a student of one of the team members of the Tarsus excavation. In fact, this professor, one of her professors at Bryn Mawr, had been to the mound at Kinet in the 1960s. So when it was threatened by destruction with the construction of the liquefied natural gas storage tanks you see on the screen, and the bulldozing and occupation of the lower part of the site, it was a natural project for her to take up. And she began a project there in 1992. The development of Turkish academia in the 1980s and 1990s, in particular the establishment of Bilkent University as the first private Turkish university in 1986, helped to alter the relationship between foreign and foreign-trained archaeologists in Turkey. With Professor Gates at Bilkent University, this excavation was a Turkish one of two used to train Bilkent undergraduate and graduate students in archaeology. The Kinet excavations have taught archaeological technique to a generation of students, mostly Turkish, with many of them now teaching and researching themselves. Where is the site? Maybe some of you can see it. It's right there with the lower city underneath LPG storage tanks. And during the Iraq War, this was the only way to get cooking gas into Iraq. And so there were lines of trucks, hundreds long, with very, very scared and doped up drivers having to make their way to Baghdad and Mosul, bringing in the cooking gas for people to make their meals in Iraq for a couple of years. With Kinet, we return over 50 years later to the area between Tarsus and Almina. The strategic value of this region we saw related to energy politics was, in earlier times, represented by the corridor it formed between the mountains and the sea, a corridor that linked North Syria through Cilicia, which Irene Winter, who is not here tonight, I think, one of our colleagues, once called in an article of hers, a geological and cultural afterthought. I love that phrase. Through Cilicia, that geological and cultural afterthought, to Anatolia. The ancient name of Kinet, which is Issos, bears out its geostrategic value. The famous battle of that name was fought between Alexander and Darius nearby. Professor Gates, a Bronze Age archaeologist herself, wished to explore relations not so much between East and West, as in the 1930s, but between the North and the South, the Hittite heartland of Anatolia and northern Syria. So we're talking about this zone right here with the Amanos Mountains right there. The much ballyhooed Mediterranean climate is in evidence in this area, hot summers and rainy winters, with only one difference. This is one of the few areas in the Mediterranean where it rains in the summer. And this contributes to the already hot and humid air, but it also contributes to the flow of a series of short torrents that run east-west from the Amanos Mountains into the sea across that coastal plain. And it also contributes to the development of a thick rainforest-like cover in the Amanos Mountains, famous in antiquity for their cedar, but also pine and oak. With logging over the millennia, these rivers have shifted their beds often so that the soils they brought down with them from the mountains aggraded their beds. In a region without good natural harbors, this has contributed to what our geologists call a dynamic fluvial environment, unquote. With the settlement mound, which you see there in red, of Kinet, caught between the oscillation of two of these dynamic fluvial systems, the larger one being the aptly named Delicay, or Crazy Creek in Turkish. Started out next to the mound, and where is it now? It's down there. Even the mound itself is buried under meters of alluvium, mostly dating to the Roman period, when settlement expanded way up into the hills. We still don't know where the harbor at Kinet is. Perhaps it is under those gas storage tanks, but the handicaps of flooding, wetlands, and a narrow farming area did not discourage more or less continuous settlement here from the ceramic Neolithic through the Hellenistic eras. One thing that attracted Professor Gates to the site was Woolley's desideratum of no Roman overburden. The Roman Mansio of Issos, because there's a very large Roman Mansio, is located off the mound several kilometers to the south. Although geomagnetic prospection, which you see in these thin trenches up here in the T area, has given us a 5 or 6 meter wide Roman road. The main road from Antioch leading north leads directly by the site, but the Romans didn't seem to have spent much time on the mound itself. Okay, so now I'd like to switch to introduction and the narrative after all of these frames, and go from the bottom to the top, from the earliest medieval to the latest medieval settlement at the top, at the mound. As at Tarsus and Almina, so settlements to the north and the south, the overburden at Kinet up to 1.5 meters of it was medieval. The medieval occupation of Kinet lasts for just under 2 centuries, from the middle of the 12th century to sometime in the early to mid 14th century. The strata can be dated by coin finds. The inhabitants of Kinet raised what anthropologists call the Mediterranean packet of animals, that is sheep, goat, and cattle, with the addition of pig. They also seem to have, they didn't fish very much. They hunted boar and roe, red, and fallow deer, more hunting earlier, less hunting later in the settlement. They dry farmed barley and wheat, no surprise here, just like the livestock, to be expected, as is the presence of grape pips and olive stones. Unusual was their cultivation of irrigated crops of cotton and rice, presumably in these riverbeds, but never that Crusader-era cash cow crop of sugarcane, which made so much money for the Ayyubids, Mamluks, Cypriots, etc. By the way, the first 1521 Ottoman tax survey of this region shows that they're still growing rice here, and it seems to have been grown around Antakya in Mamluk times as well. In Mamluk times as well as earlier. Cattle bones show signs of traction. They must have been used for plowing as much as eating, or sources of milk. Sheep, goat likewise were raised for their wool, with pigs likely the main source of animal protein. Equids abound, horse and donkey presumably again used more for transport than eating. So far there's been no DNA testing of these bones to see if any of the domesticated animals originated in Western Europe. And this is a cooking pot from a particular operation in Kinet, where we found eggshells in it. So presumably they were having egg dishes as well every once in a while to relieve the monotony of what was probably a lot of porridge like gruel. If you'd like some affect to go with your stables and your barley gruel, then let's look at some images of adornment. Personal ornament is represented at Kinet by beads, metal bangles, bone combs, and bone and copper buckles, and the occasional ring, and one gaming piece for fun. So here are some examples of elements of personal adornment. The first medieval settlers likely did not encounter the smooth top mound that we see today. That flat top is indicative of the presence of a fortification wall. So the fortification wall is there. It would erode if it weren't there, even its foundations. The fortification wall at Kinet dates to the 4th century BC. That's Achaemenid Persian, but it was likely standing, at least part of it was standing, when the first settlers came sometime in the 12th century. What they did with their settlement is similar to what you see at other hilltop settlements in the region. Here is the plan from British excavations at the site of Taşkınkale in Elazığ, now under the Keban Dam waters. And this gives you an idea of the kind of settlement that we have. But those of you who are archaeologists will know that in the 5th millennium BC at Yumuktepe in Tarsus, you have a very similar layout as well. So since I'm in an Islamic archaeology, architecture program, I had to show some architecture, even though we have to wonder about the Islamic valence of it if Crusaders, Mongols, Muslims, as well as whoever the people were in the 5th millennium BC are all building with the same materials and also using the same plan. The fact of mud brick architecture, including defensive architecture, alone significantly alters one's idea about the region. Conditions as these ideas are by, if you go through this region, the remains of many massive stone fortifications, mostly built or rebuilt at this time, many by Armenian barons and the kings of Armenian Cilicia, some by the knights of the Crusader military orders garrisoned here. Massive stone architecture is a sign of state intervention, but the plan of the initial medieval settlement at Kinet is too, with its ordered, simple one-phase planning, both within the walls of the mound, as well as the regular layout of buildings and a street on the east terrace below. This first settlement involved another economic activity, the making of iron implements. We found a double-chambered sunken iron smelting furnace, a stone pavement next to it, scattered with iron scale and slag and pits surrounding it filled with charcoal, slag, and bits of iron, what some of the excavators called in their notebook Pittsburgh. In fact, ironworking continued to be a major activity at the site, as hundreds of iron nails, arrowheads, knives, horseshoes, sickles, adzes, and other implements testify. a caltrop I found after a lot of research is something that you throw in front of a charging horse to make it stumble, if you're wondering what that is. This initial settlement phase was not long, and people packed up and left. So unless somebody is chasing you away or coming after you, you tend to leave a fairly clean up before you leave. So we have few finds from this initial settlement, but we do have one seal, 12th century Byzantine lead seal, used for sealing a document of some sort. And we also have coins, copper coins of the Principality of Antioch, the Franco-Norman Principality of Antioch, and a few Byzantine copper foles. In addition, we have bowls from the Aegean. Okay? And one of the interesting things about Kinet is from the very beginning all the way to the end, you have bowls that are chemically and stylistically, et cetera, identifiable as having been made all thousands of kilometers away in the Aegean. And it starts here at the very beginning. I'm trying to show you as many complete bowls as possible. And these come from later later phases, but we found these in the earlier period as well. Now, Cyprus was part of the Byzantine Empire in the 12th century, and we thought that with Kinet here and Cyprus right here, that these ceramics should come from Cyprus because it's right over the horizon, and not from the Aegean. But it turns out we're wrong, and that ceramic production of glazed ceramics in Cyprus does not start until after the Crusaders conquered the island in 1191, and it starts, ceramic production in Cyprus starts in the early 13th century. Additional affiliation with the Principality of Antioch in the initial occupation and the subsequent reoccupation of Kinet comes in the form of coinage. Billen, which is a mixture of copper and silver, helmet deniers, and they're called helmet deniers because of this Darth Vader-like character head on the other side with the closed visor, and of course a Latin inscription calling the ruler the Count of Antioch, a Byzantine title and not prince, which he was actually through Norman lineage. And then this sign of sort of brute force on the other side. This is the highest value coinage of the principality. In fact, we found, with the help of a few moles who kicked up the first part of the hoard, we have a 47 coin hoard of this coinage, which, despite the fact that it was the most minted of all Crusader coinages, traveled the shortest distance, seemingly never used beyond the borders of the principality. So what was it doing here in the border zone that lay to the north of the Principality of Antioch for most of its life? The reoccupation of the site duplicated the initial settlement. Walls were built on top of walls, and basically the same kind of settlement pattern was added, except a pavement was added to the middle of the site. This settlement, as you can tell from the color of this slide, was sacked and burned. And there's a lot of ash and all sorts of stuff there, but no bodies. From this first destruction level, the first of three, we have burned clay impressed with branches and reeds, evidence of roofing. So we know what the tops of these structures were like from what fell down. And complete pots, and even the bones of a fetal pig spilling out of a cooking pot. After a period of abandonment, the site is reoccupied. A second upper street is laid in the middle of the mound, and a new fortification wall is laid out around it with casemates behind it. This period introduces Armenian coinage to the site. Dozens of coins of the kings of Armenian Cilicia in this and the later levels make them the most frequently recovered at the site. All but two of these Armenian coins are lower value copper coins called tanks or Kardez in Armenian. Antiochene deniers continued to be used as the denomination of higher worth. So you have the coinage of one state being used at one level and the coinage of another state being used at another at the same site. Also in this phase, the east terrace buildings, which you see here in the square down here at the base of the site, are reoccupied and rebuilt. And it seems as if the production of Port Saint Symeon ceramics starts at Kinet. Here they are in there with the street running between the two structures. And I've been working at this site so long that some of you may be able to barely recognize Oya Pancarolu there in the corner there. And she was still a graduate student, 1997. From here we have a tripod stilt used in pottery kilns and biscuit-fired unglazed sherds of Port Saint Symeon ceramics. In addition to bowls, glazed Port Saint Symeon style tiles were produced here. They have been found as far away as Acre, the capital of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. One fragmentary tile, which you see on the left, which we know was locally produced from chemical analysis of its fabric, appears to show a narrative scene with a warrior carrying a shield and a horse, and some shrubbery to go with it as well. Could these naive provincial representations in some way echo the wall paintings of palaces, residences, and castle banqueting halls of the time, some of which we know from texts and some of which we actually have documented? And from Acre, this is a new find from a couple of years ago. We have our friend, the cupbearer, except that he can't wait. He's drinking himself. And recently, the excavators at Acre have found part of a church that was paved with glazed tiles. Bear that in mind. This phase, too, is burned, although here, as before and after, the inhabitants seem to have been able to save themselves, if not their belongings. There seems to be no evidence of a fight, at least in the presence of human remains in the destruction levels. From the casemate rooms that you see here at the edge of the site, right, here's the edge of the mound, and there's a series of these rooms with nice floors. You have high status items, likely of foreign manufacture, right on these floors, like this lance, which is the only one found at Kinet. And we know that in general, the Islamic armies did not fight with lances, and Byzantines did not fight with lances until they learned about it from Frankish fighting techniques. And one of the things that I have to do this year is figure out where these curly-cued, very large lance comes from. Presumably, it's an import. We also have one of the few ivory objects from the site, again, from these rooms, including this fragment of an ivory comb with a feline of some sort on one side and a cross on the other. And Avinoam Shalem has helped me with some of the comparanda. The best, closest one seems to be in the treasury of Bamberg Cathedral. So again, perhaps an import. These are known as bishop's combs in the literature, but there's not a bishop in sight here, so there's no reason to think that they are part of some sort of a church profession here. This third occupation level was only partially reoccupied in the fourth and final architecture phase, which dates to the early 14th century. This last phase resembled a village more than a fort. It had no fortifications. However, the production of Port Saint Symeon ceramics continued. More amazingly, considering the dwindling size of the settlement and its unplanned layout, is the wealth and variety of ceramics found here. Even though this last level lay, as you can see from the slide on the left, partially in the modern plow zone, it produced amazing evidence of hasty abandonment, including what you see on the right, stacked vessels of Port Saint Symeon ware upside down. This is right side up. They were found upside down, and there was a fourth one, as if they had dropped off of a shelf. They were found inside a room, And many of these vessels were found together with mortars and other evidence, cooking pots, other things that you possibly might want to take with you if you had time to pack up and leave. But the most amazing thing about this last phase of habitation at Kinet in the medieval period is that together with the usual Aegean, as we saw earlier, and Beiruti imports, we also have roulette bowls from Venice, proto-maiolica from southern Italy, and from Islamic lands, the highest quality underglazed artificial paste body bowls and enameled beakers, both likely manufactured in Aleppo or somewhere else in northern Syria. So here's a Beiruti production of so-called frying pan, another Beiruti production. Here's your typical 13th century Venetian rouletted. You've heard about Russian roulette, but you didn't know the Venetians did it too. And here are some of these really amazingly high quality bowls that we have again from the early 14th century levels that, by the way, those of you who study this stuff, doesn't fit the classification schemes. There's supposed to be red on these bowls, but there isn't. And here's our beaker, which was burned, so we had to just make a drawing of it. Surely most of these wares were either imported and destined for export to the interior, or they were destined to be exported. And yet, we have an interesting context. And this context may not look so interesting to you. It's a 3 by 5 meter room, again, just under the plow zone, in the plow zone, that furnished the best example of something that could be related to, I hate this word, identity, as well as use of ceramics. And we have this ability to do this based not only on recovery inside this room, but also on a 6-pointed, scratched-in owner's mark on 4 ceramic vessels. These 4 ceramic vessels were 3 bowls and a jug. So here's the jug, and here's the owner's mark that's been scratched on it. And then it's found in the same room in the middle of ash and all sorts of collapse with this bowl, which is a Port Saint Symeon bowl. We sampled it. It was made at the site. And it has 2 of these owner's marks on it. It shows a knight in armor carrying a shield. He may have a quiver as well. And he's on a horse. And these other 2 bowls, one of which also has a index of Crusaderness with a small upside-down shield here with a cross on it, and the same marker here. And then, again, doubly marked, a bowl which you see in a bad reproduction here, and a drawing here, which not only has the same owner's mark from the same room, but it has also 2 Armenian alphabet letters, the Abe and the Ra. I don't know Armenian, so I thank Christina Moranchi, who is not here this evening, from Tufts University for identifying these for me. So do we have a matter then of reflecting a reality, as I said before, or do we have something aspirational in this picture of the knight and this mismatched set of bowls together with a ewer, with a jug? You don't expect to drink out of a bowl, especially ones these sizes. They have a diameter of about 26 to 28 centimeters. Plus, from this same level, we found the beaker, an actual glass beaker. Very high status thing, so presumably the drinking is taking place out of the beaker. And the beaker says, is li maulana al malik al alam al adil, has all these nice Ayyubid and Mamluk slogans, so that our fearless leader, the Crusader, with his horse and his shield, is drinking out of a glass that is being prized and its Islamic valence is being ignored. And this is something that you found at Almina, you find it at Acre, and most recently Israeli archaeologists at Arsur have found that the Knights Templar, who were actually, hacked to bits by Baibars in 1260, actually were drinking out of similar bowls that, similar goblets that had the names of their foes written on them. So it's an interesting matter of the luxury quotient and the class quotient, I guess, trumping the Islamic index of it, or something. So those of you who have come to this talk looking for the Crusader history in an archaeology that is, after all, historical, may be wondering where the history is in this account. Up until now, I have purposefully avoided introducing historical information to flesh out or question the archaeological record at Kinet. Who burned the site to a crisp 3 separate times? What about the overlap between Antioch and Armenian Cilician coins? Trade relations with Italian maritime republics, Zengids, Ayyubids, and Mamluks, Cyprus, and what about that famous quote from Willibrand of Oldenburg, the German spy and pilgrim, that says that Armenians, Franks, Greeks, Turks, and other Muslims all lived in this region in the early 13th century. There are 2 reasons behind my purposeful privileging of the archaeological record in my talk. The first and foremost one is what one medieval archaeologist has called the tyranny of the text. Archaeology is the handmaiden, the cupbearer, if you will, of history, and one digs really in order to confirm written sources. The second reason has to do with my view of governance at this time, the multiplicity of non or only quasi-state actors in what we call the Crusader arena. I have another. To my mind, the Frankish states of the Eastern Mediterranean and their Armenian neighbors to the north were not colonial states in any sense of the word. The castles of the military orders, you see Croix de Chevalier here again on the screen in a picture from the French publication, Deschamps publication, after it had been, the Christian village inside it had been cleared out. The castles of the military orders, often thought of as the most impressive features of the 200 years of Frankish rule in the Levant, castles like Croix de Chevalier were not built by state actors or with state monies, but with money from Western Europe by those who did not answer to state authority, which is the military orders who answered to the Pope. If there were colonies, they were the implantations of the Italian merchant republics. At first, seasonally inhabited emporia, this is acre, seasonally inhabited emporia, and then beginning in the 13th century, fully functioning cities within cities. So with the Genoese quarter here, the Venetian quarter there, for instance, in one coastal city, Acre, the capital of the Kingdom of Jerusalem in the 13th century. The debased elite imagery found on Port Saint Symeon ceramics can be seen in this context as acceptable, even desirable, around the Mediterranean, orientalizing and perhaps even oriental and perhaps orientalist, I want to say, catering to people's expectations of those luxurious breezes flowing from the east. The cupbearer is encouraging consumption, not only of the bowl he decorates, but the wine in the cup, and of course the cup itself, now that enameled glass production was up and running in Venice, for instance, as it was by the end of the 13th century. I link the rise and spread of Port Saint Symeon ware to direct investment in the trade in glazed ceramics at a time when they did not exist in most of Western, non-Islamic Europe and none of Northern Europe. By contrast, the Kinet warrior bowl and the fragmentary tile with the narrative scene from Kinet can be seen as evidence of a typical idea of the Crusades, the fight of the horse-born knightly Christian elite against a Muslim enemy, as a local example of a completely different animal, the pan-Mediterranean battle for power, often simplified in the cliched phrase, town versus crown. In contrast to the situation in Italy, on the Levantine littoral in the 13th century, the town, that is the Italian maritime republics, only had problems with the crown in Lusignan, Cyprus, and then only temporarily the Genoese got the upper hand. The landed aristocracy, whether Franco-Norman or Armenian, especially in the northern states, cedes wealth to the bourgeois Italians, even intermarrying with rich bourgeois families. Again, sounding a little bit like a Henry James novel set in the 13th century, if you will. Granted, the state had its laws, its armies, its courts, and its churches, but it was the military orders, the Templars and the Hospitallers, and also in the 13th century, the Teutonic Knights, that defended these borders against Muslims, of course, but also in this region of Christian against Christians. So the military orders in the region of Kinet have Franks and Normans to the south and Armenians to the north. Where are the Muslims they're guarding against? They're guarding against fighting between two Christian polities. The Antiochene coinage at Kinet can be seen as nothing more than protection money from a state unable to guard its own borders. And yet, if indeed, as the sources both Latin and Arabic tell us, Kinet was a Templar fort, the kind of architecture, its layout, and the lack of what they call in archaeology intra-site variability strongly indicates that any Western European knights at the site, and we don't know if there were any at all, any Western European knights at the site were living as, like, and with local Christians, whatever their ethnicity. And presumably women as well. Remember, the military orders have taken vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. There seems to be no evidence of a masculine space there that excludes the women's space at all. But gendered archaeology is not something you can really prove, at least I can't. At present, because of the hold that the Kingdom of Jerusalem has on the scholarly and public imagination, and because of an active tradition in Israel, which is rooted in German scholarship, of top-notch Israeli scholarship on the Crusades, not just their archaeology, we have a view of the Crusades that is centered on excavations at coastal cities in present-day Israel, like Acre, which we just saw, and Arsuf, which I mentioned, with other excavations, not Israeli excavations, at Caesarea and at Ashkelon, and with a few exceptions of monumental fortifications in the interior. So archaeology is centered then in cities and in large castles, and to a much, much lesser extent in the countryside. Because much, if not most, Crusader archaeology in Israel is undertaken by the Israeli Archaeology Authority, there is a constant pressure to excavate and publish and move on to the next site, as most excavations are salvage ones. The ability to do research and analysis, one of the features of academic archaeology, therefore, is lacking from practically all Crusader area archaeology in the Eastern Mediterranean. And some of you may have read last year there was one of these huge Brussels grants. Brussels likes to give grants to ideas and projects that unite European countries. And a group of scholars decided that they would put together a project on the expansion of the military orders and the Crusades in the Baltic, not in the Eastern Mediterranean. And so they're excavating in the Baltic states as well as in Poland and in Germany because there's a similar expansion in this area. And when this story broke, they then went, of course, to Israeli archaeologists and said, well, was there really extirpation of peoples and the introduction of plants and animals, species from Western Europe, as the archaeologists are trying to prove? Is there a genocide of the Wends and the Slavic peoples who are forcibly converted by these Teutonic Knights, etc.? And the Israeli archaeologists, like every other archaeologist of the Crusades, had to say, we don't know, because they don't have the time and the money and they have the inclination, but they can't do the botanical analysis, they can't do the DNA analysis on the bones to see where these things come from. So in essence, the other Crusader archaeology then, with this very lavishly Brussels-funded project in the Baltic, will probably then come back and tell us something more or maybe different about another kind of crusade, another area of crusades with this academically based research project in the Baltic. A different bright spot in Crusader archaeology, paradoxically, lies in Greece and to a lesser extent in Cyprus, where the Frangokratia has long been ignored, and that's a nice word for it, if not avoided or destroyed. The study of interactions between a Frankish ruling elite and a Greek populace on the Greek mainland, and Venetian rulers and Cretan Greeks on Crete, and to a lesser extent in Cyprus with the Lusignans, the Genoese, and the Venetians and the local Greek Orthodox population, is being undertaken by a new generation of Greek archaeologists and offers some help of well-researched multidimensional projects combining survey, documentation of standing remains, and excavation, including those of the Frankish period in the 13th, 14th, and into the 15th centuries. In Greece and Cyprus, however, medieval archaeologists, not just Greek and Cypriot, have started using the dread word convivencia. And the word convivencia, of course, we know comes from the Iberian Peninsula and comes to us as a utopia for a time when under Muslim leadership, Jews, Christians, and Muslims all got together, they got along just fine, and that's something that then is being used actively in the archaeological literature to describe what happens between Christians and Christians, that is Orthodox and Latin Christians in Cyprus and in Greece. And my question is in this mutation of this word convivencia in the East, is it painting a rosy picture because the convivencia is not with Muslims involved, and so having a Frankish ruler is better than having a Muslim one. But it's something that, of course, is being used sometimes advisedly by young scholars who use, not everybody uses this term. Certainly we see the, okay, I've gotten that part. Now, with the exception of Harvard's own Michael McCormick, Chris Wickham, an early medieval historian at Oxford, is the historian that I know of who does the most incorporation of archaeological material in the writing of history. Those of you who don't know that Framing the Middle Ages, his first great work, I know I shouldn't recommend any books to this audience, but it's really, he puts an extreme amount of effort into incorporating archaeological data into the study of the Mediterranean, and he just matter-of-factly includes the early Islamic states, the Abbasids and the Umayyads, in his work, just without even blinking an eyelid. So it's funny in his latest chef-d'oeuvre to see these statements in the introduction, and the highlighting is mine, when he talks about archaeology. They're long statements. I won't make the pedagogical error of reading them. I just put them up, reading them aloud. I put them up here for you to read. But it's really quite something to read phrases like archaeology, like history, is free of the constraints of narrative, but not the constraints of communication. We're getting a little bitter here. In my presentation today, by presenting the medieval levels at Kinet bottom up, I have tried to present an archaeological narrative of settlement, an archaeological narrative, on purpose taking the historical sources out of the picture. The intrusion of text exists in archaeology in the form of coins, and these coins have given us a chronology to this narrative, as well as shown the constraints of attempting to write history using state actors. As we said before, Kinet lay in a contested border zone between two states, at first baronial Armenian polities and the Principality of Antioch, then the Kingdom of Armenian Cilicia and Antioch, and finally, in the last decades of its existence, between the Mamluk Sultanate, and Armenian Cilicia, after the fall of Antioch in 1268. The second intrusion of writing, non-narrative writing, if you will, into the archaeological record is that Armenian graffito. But what kind of story does that tell? But there is definitely a story there to tell. So there is, I'm trying to argue, a way to do a narrative without saying only historians can write narratives with material culture. Historians tell us it was the Templars who guarded this interstitial zone between Antioch and Cilicia, but Mamluk historians like Ibn al-Furat tell us of the crisping of the castle of Tinat in 1261, which probably marked the end of the major non-state actors, the military orders there. But archaeological evidence in the form of massive amounts of glazed Port Saint Symeon ceramics and many, many, many more nails and other iron objects than was necessary for a small site like Kinet point to the importance of export of these items, which is why other non-state actors, the Genoese, who were especially active in this region at this time, are likely involved as well. In fact, we have a document. It's not a narrative document, but we have a Genoese document from the archives that is for the export of oak from the port of Canamella, which is the Crusader name for this site. So most likely, and early Islamic, again, sources, geographers tell us that it's the export of timber from the mountains that is the real source of income. But this is something that is completely lacking in the archaeological record, of course, along with whatever textiles they wove from those sheep and goats. Wickham is right. Archaeology does not tell us who owned the land at Kinet, nor who paid the rents. But unlike manufacture at the site, agriculture and animal husbandry do not seem to be geared to the production of commodities for export. Cotton seed and rice grains are not found in significant enough numbers to argue this, and there is no evidence of large-scale storing of agricultural surplus. Salvage archaeology at Kinet has given us what urban archaeology at cities like Tarsus or Antioch or Acre, for that matter, have not. A stratified sequence of 150-odd years of medieval history on the margins of a marginal liminal set of occupations and interactions up and down the Levantine coast. The combination of happenstance and intention that led to the excavation at Kinet perhaps can be seen as fitting this age, too, with its concerns over the reliability of knowledge, the distrust of ethnic and nationalist master narratives, and a desire on the part of some scholars to explore the complexities of interactions and connections. Am I allowed to say connectivities? Connections, then, if not connectivities, between cultures and polities. So I will leave you with two examples of these. A fantastic beast incised on a bowl, made in Liguria, and very obviously copying a Port Saint Symeon model, and recovered during the excavations in the Palazzo Ducale in Genoa, with other sherds that also copy the Port Saint Symeon repertoire. And then even further afield, a tile from the Abbey of Chertsey, the Benedictine Abbey of Chertsey, which was remodeled in the middle of the 13th century. And the people who found this tile, which is in Chertsey outside of London now, call it a symbol of Aquarius. But now that I have indoctrinated you into Port Saint Symeon ceramics, you can see a seated, cross-legged figure with a turban holding a cup with a ewer in the other side. Thank you very much. Any questions? As you know, people have any questions, please. Okay, so I did a 10-year project of, here's my Here's my teşekkür. I did a 10-year project with my colleague, now retired from the Smithsonian. We drilled holes in the fabric of over 200 samples of Port Saint Symeon and Aegean ceramics as well. And since we found evidence of production at Kinet with that trivet, and Lane found evidence in Port Saint Symeon itself, I went to the Victorian Albert with my drill, I had to buy a drill and get it through English customs, British customs, and I drilled holes in the Port Saint Symeon pottery. Eva's looking like this. This is all very positivist, isn't it? I drilled holes in that, and we did chemical analysis of stuff that we know came from there, and we know came from Kinet. Then other people have found evidence of production at other sites like Missis, which is another site to the north. And there's so much of it that it has to be produced at a whole series of centers that are, some of them in the Principality of Antioch, some of them in the Kingdom of Armenia and Cilicia, some of them in between. So we can't say even that it's a Crusader ceramic at all. And that's why I'm involving the Italians, specifically the Genoese, in this massive export all around, but it's also carried inland as well. So many, many production centers. We've only found 3, but there must have been many of them, okay? And so you're asking me for a master narrative just when second question, you've asked me for a master narrative just when I've said we have to be careful about master narratives, but Guru is famous for always pushing her students to get the most out of the subjects that they work on. And yeah, no, I mean, I just basically, as you may have caught my drift, I basically think the state doesn't exist most of the time, and until it does, as they say in Turkish, when the bird of the state sits on you, it's really terrible, but that bird is never around at all most of the time. So people who are being supposedly paid from Antioch to guard the frontiers are busy running lumber industry, and there seems to be a really sort of improvisatory way of living there that's not actually that limited to the north, because in the south as well you have knights on the interior who are coming directly from France, and Italians living on the coast, and the people who actually live there in between are 10 to 15% of the population, with everybody else speaking Arabic and Aramaic. And so you have very little sense of the ability of local people to develop a production, let alone consumption, that reflects their ideas of what they are. That's why the odd picture of a depiction of a knight is amazing. And I wanted to add an Islamic valence to this. If you think about Ayyubid and Mamluk self-representation of elite, you don't even look at ceramics, right? You look at metalwork. And so people aren't making metalwork in these areas because they don't have the time and the money to do this sort of stuff. So we're left with ceramics because we deal with archaeology, but also we're dealing with a much lower sort of thing. But think of a similar set of concerns in the depictions of courts and the mounted chivalric elite of the interior of Syria, Palestine at that time, and you have ideals in that respect. So I would say that the more I study this stuff, I deal with things that are not there, and so comparing what's in Islamic societies at this time is not found in these Frankish societies is as interesting as anything else. Yeah. Yeah, they're definitely peddling ideas of luxury consumption in this fairly cheap ware, mass-produced ware, and sending it all the way around. But, you know, it's our idea that it's only Muslims that have turbans. There's a famous article about Western Byzantine sources where people in the Morea are complaining about the Byzantines in the East who were dressing in turbans in the 11th century and kaftans in the 11th century. So again, we have to be careful about what we think is an Oriental depiction of Muslims. And it also seems to be commissioned by Italians, right? I mean, to do this. And I know Antonio will say Italy doesn't exist at this time. I know it's shorthand for mercantile republics. Dana?
There's clearly an aesthetic consensus in the ware, right?
Absolutely. Somebody's handing out, you know. In this study, we did the more complex things like the Dumbarton Oaks ewer, Dumbarton Oaks Amphora were made in Port Saint Symeon. We tested it. So there's definitely the better port does the more complex iconography, and the provincial port of Kinet does the sort of cartoony-like drawings that you saw there. So and we've established that chemically. So you have workshops. They're making the same thing, but the ones at Almina are more complex and better executed than other ones.
So my question is,
Oh, sorry.
what does that mean? Is there something behind it, obviously, where there is a consensus about consumption of the same kind of symbolic, right? And whether at the lower level or a higher level. And though there is no state, and you are going at, which I'm with, there's no hegemonic power that is presenting itself to somebody else. But there is something that is happening elsewhere, right? So have you tried to not offer master narrative, but look at a question of faith?
Yeah, and that's where you look for. That's what this chemical sampling and that room with the scratches on pottery is so important, because it's showing, and we only have a handful of these, the use of one of these bowls that shows a knight. That people were capable, and they're producing the ceramics there at this little site. So you can just imagine him walking down the hill and saying, I want to see myself as I think I should be, but this is my speculation of it, because they're so rare. Statistically, they're so rare. And by the way, we also sampled that piece in the Metropolitan Museum of Art that I showed you, and that was made at Almina. But was it found there? We don't know, because it ended up on the art market. Yes.
I'm struck just visually at how much they resemble 9th and 10th century toy splashware, and also some funerary ware. Is it just toys that was a long, simple experiment?
Okay, so here you have Arthur Lane being pulled out of the Victoria and Albert Museum in 1937 and brought out to what's then French mandate Syria by Sir Leonard Woolley, who's a sir by then, and he was a young man, he must have been quaking in his shoes. And when you read his reports, he is completely awash in Samara, because he's read the reports of the Samara excavations. But he goes down to the Palestinian Sian John's publication, and they don't look at all like this. And so he really doesn't know what to do with these orientalizing figures, which look Islamic but don't compare to the splashwares that he knows. But he's a smart guy, and he figures out that there is a tradition, which he's correct in. There's a tradition there that our friends, the Italians, if I'm correct, are actually taking a local ceramic production that already exists, and they're taking it and running with it, shall we say, rejiggering it and then exporting it. So you're right, there is a tradition of splashed sgraffito wares dating to 9th, 10th centuries. It's traditional always to refer them to China, like China is the origin of everything. But there is a local production there in the Antioch region that then is rejiggered. So they can't be Crusader wares for many, many reasons, because they are actually a local product. Yes, Antonio.
Everything is focused on the coast archaeology, but how obvious the relation is in like the distribution of this kind of ceramics in the inland.
Yeah, so people who look at the distribution of these ceramics say, aha, these are colonies. because you can't find these ceramics on the interior. You have Frankish states along the coast. You have these wares coming from Proto-Maiolica, roulette ware, all of these things coming from the west, and they don't get into the interior. Therefore, these are European colonists who are living here, and the Crusader states were colonial. Okay, what's the problem with this? It's the distribution of glazed ceramics. One, because of course it's so much easier to pack a 15-meter ship with 1,000 or 1,500 bowls than it is to put them on the back of a camel or a donkey, or the breakage rates are so higher. So of course you see less of them on the interior. But we still have to look back to the Danish excavations of the 1930s in Hamma, which is an inland site. And people there like their cupbearers, and in fact they are imitating them, and they're making their own local production that then is distributed. And Marcus Milwright, who is at the University of British Columbia, used to work in Jordan at Karak, and he found that in the Mamluk period, they're not importing so many ceramics from Cyprus, glazed ceramics, but they're imitating them. So the Crusaders are long gone, but they're still importing Cypriot ceramics from French Cyprus.
This for Port Saint Symeon, but all the other
No, this.
production, like for cooking pottery and storage pottery, for pottery outdoors.
Oh, you mean, yeah, it's no, the,
special kind of production,
yeah.
because it requires size specialization.
Yeah, no, there's no difference between the storage wares, the closed vessels, the open glass, the unglazed stuff here on the coast or in the interior. There's no difference in shape, size. Ioanita Vroom, who works on these things, thinks that she can find a change in Frankish eating habits that affects cooking pots in the 14th century in, what's the name of that site in southeastern Italy? I can't remember. It's not Foggia. There's a Angevine court there where they're eating lots of chicken, and she says that there are thousands of chicken bones, and the cooking pots are bigger, and this shows that the preferences of the court are different from those of the people, and the cooking pots change in size accordingly. That's the only argument I've seen that holds any sort of water, but it's a very specific one.
Also the provocation. It's easy we got the word confidential word. So when you use confidential.
Yeah.
Just a kind of spatial question on the excavation design. I'm just interested in the distribution of the digging and how that was designed.
I dig where my excavation director tells me to dig. So you want interest.
Some of the logic, again, I can understand how some of it would be by occupation layer, but how about for the actual location?
Yeah, so if we had all night, I would go back to the slides and I would show you the classic excavation strategy that Professor Gates followed was to put slit trenches down the side. So you sample the different, it's a cake, right? So you're sampling the different levels of the cake. How do you know what you have? You do a survey, you pick up sherds around it, but there's so much alluviation that most of the settlements around the site are buried. So what you do is you have these step trenches, and there were 3 of them. Only the fourth side, the south side of the mound, did not get a step trench. And then that's the first year. And then you madly look at the different pottery and you try to figure out what you have. And then based on that, then you start larger exposures and get rid of that overburden and get down to the earlier levels. So what we have are basically 2 areas of large medieval exposure that are based on the fact that on the east side of the mound, she found a Middle Bronze Age palace that she'll be talking about on the 30th of January, and she chose the middle of the north middle of the site as the area to go down and sample those Iron Age levels that she wanted. So those were the areas that had the most. So that's your sampling strategy. It's based on the team, okay? But then the moles kick up the helmet deniers. And so you have to excavate when you see coins coming up out of the ground. And so you put down a trench there, even though it's against all sort of research design. John? The excavation's over. I left in 2005, which is a long time ago now. It's over as of 4 years ago. There are 6 tons of finds in Bilkent University Faculty of Arts and Sciences basement. People continue to work on them. Another advantage of it being a Turkish excavation. The site's been turned back over to the state. There's a guardian at the site. There are 2 very lovely cases in the Antakya Museum that show in fact, when I was trawling the internet for this presentation, I found people had been taking pictures of the objects from the site and putting them on the internet because they're on display in the Antakya Museum. So the next step is for those 15 to 20 volumes to come out, with everybody writing up his or her share. But obviously, it's a site that's about 15 meters high, 30 by 20 meters, and it's only been maybe 5% sampled. There's there's just no way to exhaust it. I mean, maybe somebody else will come back later, but with these petrochemical plants going up all around it, it's going to be a not very pleasant, even more unpleasant place to excavate when not just on 2 sides, but on all 4 sides there are refineries. Tupras is building a refinery right next door. For the Islamists amongst you, a kilometer to the north, there was a Abbasid way station that was found by Asa Eger, who's at the University of North Carolina, and he's excavated that. So we have a nice small Abbasid, something between a fort and a caravanserai, very small, that's mentioned in the sources, that obviously moved there because of these dynamic fluvial environments. And there are lots of these 9th and 10th century historians, geographers talk a lot about timber exports in the Abbasid period. And obviously with Tarsus as the center of Abbasid rule in that area, you have a lot of interest in developing that area. So I think I've worn everybody out. Thank you very much.